Is anybody here today who was also here last night? Okay, so that's great, a new crowd. And I'm just saying now, last night after I finished my talk, I got about a 15-minute standing ovation, and a number of people just offered me money. Just saying, I don't imply that it's necessary here, but just to inform you.
What garments? Ladies throw garments?
So I'm well aware of why you're all here. You're not really here for me, hear me. You're here about this man right here. You're here to listen to, learn about Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln exerts a powerful force even today, so many years after his death. He is, by some estimates, he has the most words written about him of anyone in human history other than Jesus Christ. Recently surpassing Napoleon, who was 2 and is now 3. So interest in him remains strong for these 170 odd years. About 15,000 books have been published about him in this country alone, and many thousands in other countries as well. His reputation is international, it's throughout the world. And to give you a vignette about this, I'll tell you a little story about Leo Tolstoy. His picture's in the upper right-hand corner, who visited several provinces in the Caucasus in the 1880s, among them Circassia. Circassia is the country in red that you see highlighted on that Google map. It's this remote country populated by Muslim tribes who have their ancestry going back many hundreds of years, isolated, without knowledge of the world by and large. And while visiting, he was hosted by a Circassian chieftain. And while they were eating, the chief asked him to talk about heroes in Europe. Who are the heroes in the world that you know about? So he discussed with him Julius Caesar, Napoleon, and others. And then the chieftain said the following: "But you have not told us a syllable about the greatest general and greatest ruler of the world. We want to know something about him. He spoke with a voice of thunder. He laughed like the sunrise, and his deeds were strong as the rock and as sweet as the fragrance of rose. He was so great that he even forgave the crimes of his greatest enemies. His name was Lincoln, and the country in which he lived is called America. Tell us of that man." Now, it's true that Tolstoy liked Lincoln, and it's possible that he embroidered this story a little bit. Just to give you another perspective, upon Lincoln's death, this message or this note was sent to the American ambassador in Paris from the Shah of Iran. Shah of Iran had absolutely no relations with the United States. We did not have any significant trade, no direct trade, certainly. Iran itself, by definition, as being under the rule of the Shah, was an authoritarian country, and certainly had no interest or vested interest in promoting some of the ideas that Lincoln stood for. But even so, Shah of Iran felt compelled to send this note to the American ambassador on behalf of the Iranian people. What prompted this kind of greatness? I think it comes from who Lincoln was and what he represented. There are many different perspectives about Lincoln. The great historian David Herbert Donald in 1956 wrote these words: "It is practical, non-dogmatic, flexible, shrewd politician." By the way, that's bringing him down a pedestal, because if we read testimonials from the 30s and before, well, Lincoln was a great emancipator. He was the savior of the country. So by the 1950s, there had been some reevaluation of his status, and that continues to this day, further sort of lowering him down the pecking order, you might say. We'll talk about that a little bit, I hope. The Republican Party, said Eugene Debs, the first socialist to run for president of the United States in the early 1900s, was once red, and Lincoln was a revolutionary. And then we have this comment from the Chicago Times, the editorial on Election Day, 1858, following the great Lincoln-Douglas debates for Senate from Illinois. The editorial read: "A model candidate, Lincoln, due to his great leap from the platform of Negro equality to that of perpetual Negro subordination. Are there two Lincolns? And in fact, one could argue there may be many Lincolns, and part of the appeal of Lincoln is that we can find aspects of Lincoln that suit us. And I did that today. Because in my lecture, I cherry-picked things that I wanted to tell you. I could have easily cherry-picked things that portray Lincoln as a monstrous dictator, an extreme racist, or perhaps a communist. Would have been very easy to do that, but all of these aspects of Lincoln appeal to us in different ways and help promote his presence among us in our conversations even today. However, there are some intrinsic aspects of Lincoln that I hope that will illustrate to you his basic human decency and his commitment to human dignity for all. So we'll talk about that. But who is Lincoln? Some modern writers, and we'll talk about this a little bit, consider him a racist, a white supremacist who happened to do certain things that maybe worked out for slaves. Others view him as a responder. All he did was respond to what was going on. He was, in some respects, a puppet of the radical Republican Congress that he worked with during the Civil War, or alternatively, that he was actually pressured by different groups to perform in certain ways. And all he was cork bobbing on the waves. And finally, there are those who view him as radical and, you might say, ruthless, and was in fact the initiator of many of the events that we know so well that transpired not only during the Civil War, but leading up to the Civil War. And I believe that that is the case. I think his views were radical, that he used circumstances to radically impose upon the world surrounding him his views of right and wrong. And we'll illustrate that, I hope. In order to do this, I'm going to use these questions as a prism or a lens for examining Lincoln. How did he view himself? How did he view others? I'm sorry, how did others view him? How did he act? And how were his actions perceived? And then finally, how did his actions impact America and the world? In this discussion, I'm going to assume that most of you have some basic knowledge of Lincoln. This is not going to be a linear discussion. I'm not going to begin in 1809 when he was born and go to 1865 in that way. I'm going to use these questions to illustrate and amplify some of Lincoln's characteristics and actions. His own background is not as well known as we'd like. He wrote 3 autobiographies in his life. They're all extremely short. One is only like a long paragraph. The longest one he wrote was a few paragraphs long for the 1860 election, presidential run in 1860. And then he said, there's not much of me. There's not much of it. For the reason, I suppose, that there's not much of me. Can you imagine a politician today saying something like that? And then he went on to say, in his first paragraph of this autobiography, my parents were both born in Virginia of undistinguished families. Second families, perhaps I should say. I included that because I think that's terribly important. This is how he viewed himself. Lincoln was well aware of his impoverished background, of his impoverished education, of his impoverished circumstances. He understood that he came from the lowest denominator of citizens in the United States. Contemporary with Lincoln, people at that time would have said and used the expression that he came from poor white trash. That's what people would have said about him and families, millions of families like his, because of his impoverished circumstances. In his own words, he described himself as an old Henry Clay Tariff Whig. I have not since changed my views, and I can express my views on slavery by quotations from Henry Clay. It's a very illustrative quote. Henry Clay was the leader of what was called the Whig Party at that time. The Whig Party, of course, collapsed, sort of transmogrified in some ways into the Republican Party. Clay and the Whig Party stood for tariffs to protect nascent American industries. They believed strongly in they believed strongly in improvements, internal improvements, so harbors, docks, and believed in a strong central bank. Henry Clay was interesting, and Lincoln noted this himself. It was interesting in another way. Henry Clay was very interested in what happened internationally, what's going on internationally. So he was well aware of, and talked about the Bolivarian revolts and revolutions in South America. He talked about revolution and was aware of revolutions in Spain. He was very aware of the Greek Revolution in 1827. And Lincoln, through his discussions with Henry Clay, I'm sure also developed this larger worldview that we're here in America, we have issues and problems here, but there's also a larger world within which we live and function. There are three main themes to Lincoln and his views on slavery. Now, I want to illustrate them through these quotes. And the very first one is a manifestation of his moral stance, his ethical stance on slavery, where he said that you work and toil and earn bread and I'll eat it. And whether this comes from a king or from one race of men as an apology for enslaving another race, is the same tyrannical principle. So this just ethically was wrong to him. Second is a comment about the actual political landscape that he lived in. And he went on to say that either the opponents of slavery will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest and believe that it is in the course of ultimate extinction, or its advocates will push it forward till it should become, like lawful new states, old as well as new, north as well as south. This was, of course, the profound worry of many in the North and the profound desire of many in the South. That, and as Lincoln had said in his House Divided speech, we can't have this going on any longer. Half of us being slave, half being free. We have to become one or the other. And what terrified people in the North is that slavery was going to eat them alive. Slavery would expand, impact every aspect of Northern life, and come within their midst, just as it was seen in the South. And then the third aspect of Lincoln's antipathy towards slavery, I think, is illustrated by this quote. He wrote this in 1855 to his dear friend Joshua Speed. That was his very first friend from his first days in Springfield, after he moved to Springfield. And he quotes that experience by saying, in 1841, you and I had together a tedious, low-water trip on a steamboat from Louisville to St. Louis. You may remember, as I well do, that from Louisville to the mouth of the Ohio, there were on board 10 or a dozen slaves, shackled together with irons. That sight was a continued torment. And I see something like it every time I touch the Ohio. He said this numerous other times. There are many other quotes, other people in letters and oral discussion, stating his profound sense of hurt, his personal sense of disgust with the sight of slaves being shackled. So this was to him very, very personal and part of his overall view of slavery in conjunction with his political view and his ethical view in the abstract. So I think that we can say that Lincoln was clearly anti-slavery. And he was very well known for saying, if slavery is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. I don't think any academic or writer today would dispute his anti-slavery stance. They might dispute why, but the fact that he was vocal from his earliest political days, from 1837 on, repeatedly vocal in his antipathy and resistance to slavery, is unquestioned. But what about the issue of Lincoln and race in general? And here Lincoln opens himself up to some criticism. During the race for Senate, 1858, and as part of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, there were 9 of them throughout the state. Illinois is 390 miles long from north to south. The northern part had been inhabited primarily by people from Pennsylvania, New York, Western New York particularly, and to a lesser extent Indiana. So these were people who had come from northern areas and as a rule had northern attitudes towards slavery in general, which was anti-slavery, anti-Black. because even though they may be anti-slavery, there was enormous prejudice in northern Illinois as there was in southern Illinois. Southern Illinois, on the other hand, was inhabited by folks who come primarily from the South, particularly from Kentucky and Tennessee, but also from North Carolina, all of whom migrated over the years to southern Illinois. So attitudes there were very different about Blacks and slavery in particular, so that you see Lincoln changed his tune, as I illustrated here in these quotes, and whether he was in the northern part of the state, as he was in Ottawa, where he said, let's discard all this quibbling, let's discard all these things and unite as one people throughout this land until we shall once more stand up declaring all men are created equal. That's in Ottawa. Just a few days later in Charleston, he says, I am not nor ever have been in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and Black races. And I put in parentheses applause, because that was an applause line for him in Charleston. By the way, the Lincoln-Douglas debates were the first political activities to be covered by reporters writing shortly. So there would be reporters from the major newspapers around the country who would be there, write down every word these men said, transcribe them, and send them, and the shorthand had just recently been invented, and then send them through another recently invented mechanism, the telegraph, to their newspapers, so that what these men said was published in the newspapers the very next day. It was an amazing advance in terms of communication for important political races. So as I remember, this was not any political race, because Douglass, who you see on the right here, by the way, this picture was photoshopped together. They never appeared together this way. But Douglass was clearly an aspirant for the presidency of 1860. He was the author of many important attempts to modulate the slavery issue in America. He was the author of Popular Sovereignty, implying that people who entered a territory could decide themselves whether or not they wanted slavery or not. Position that really proved to be untenable. So this was an incredibly important race, and it was followed on the national scene and really thrust Lincoln into the limelight nationally. What did others say about Lincoln and race? We have Frederick Douglass, who said that emphatically Black man's president. Dr. Jacob Thomas, who's the lead pastor of the African Methodist Episcopalian Zion Church, a big church in Washington, D.C., and it was an important person in terms of both the Civil War sort of activities, as well as particularly in post-war Reconstruction, who called him a second Moses. W.E.B. Du Bois, the great Black early 20th century historian, in a very, very famous passage, described him, his first words in that passage was, I love him. And then goes on to describe how Lincoln was inconsistent in everything that he did, but nonetheless called him, quote, nonetheless, quote, a great man. And he was, and this is his most famous line, he was big enough to be inconsistent because he encompassed the entire field of thought during the pre-war and during the war periods. Then there were a couple of other perspectives, though. This fellow that I quote here, H. Douglass, was a young African-American living in the North, in Boston, and was extremely active in abolitionist circles. He said, I know Abraham Lincoln, and I know something about his anti-slavery. He is an ally of the slave power. And his words became prominent because they were later picked up by Malcolm X, who quoted this fellow generously in terms of what Lincoln, quote, really was like. Then finally, in 1968, Lerone Bennett, some of you may know of Lerone Bennett, who was for 40 years the publisher of Ebony magazine, very, very, very important in the 60s in terms of the civil rights movement, being a very close associate to Martin Luther King. And he wrote an article in 1968 that later became a book, Forced into Glory. And I just picked any number of statements from him. but he's the very essence of the white supremacist with good intentions. So these are different perspectives on Lincoln and race. We'll never have a complete perspective. But I can tell you my perspective is that Lincoln, by today's standards, absolutely would be judged racist based on the things you've read right here, but based on the standards and based on the environment in which he lived. He was actually an extraordinarily liberal individual who promoted and spoke about promoting, not just internally promoted, but spoke openly about promoting the rights of Blacks in this country. I think the best illustration of his attitudes toward race come from this letter that he wrote to a friend in 1854, long before he ran for Senate, where he wrote, "Our progress and degeneracy appears to me to be pretty rapid. As a nation, we began by declaring that all men are created equal. We now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. When the know-nothings get control, it will read, all men are created equal except Negroes and foreigners and Catholics. When it comes to this, I should prefer emigrating to some country where they make no pretense of liberty to Russia." And another instance of how he really felt is this little picture that I had. It says, I'm sorry, it's small, you can't see it well. It's a tombstone to William Johnson. William Johnson was his personal valet. He brought him with him to Washington from Springfield. He talked to him every day, naturally, but he also talked to him about politics. He talked to him about the issues of emancipation. He talked to him also very interestingly about the issue of sending freed Blacks back to Africa. The man died in 1864, and without any fanfare whatsoever, without informing the newspapers or talking to anybody about it. He had him buried in Arlington Cemetery, right at the foot of Arlington House. It's there today, right at the foot of Arlington House, the house of Robert E. Lee. And inscribed on it is the man's name, William Johnson, and underneath it just one word, citizen. And that was a slap in the face to those who really were in slave power and claimed that Negroes were not citizens. And of course, that was the Tawney decision of 1857. So I think that really reflects more accurately his own internal feelings about Blacks as a race. We talked about it in various other ways as well. It's important to remember that Lincoln viewed his political environment through the lens of the Declaration of Independence. You're all familiar with the Gettysburg Address. It begins 407 years ago. Well, if you do the math and go back 407 years, it does not bring you to 1788, the first year of our constitutional existence as the United States of America. It brings you back to 1776, the year of the Declaration. He felt that the Declaration is in fact the founding document of the United States and expressed therein the most noble sentiments, particularly that all men are created equal. He comes back to all men are created equal repeatedly, hundreds of times in his speeches throughout the years. And I've just included here too, where he describes the fact that that statement that all men are created equal is an electric cord in that declaration that links the hearts of patriotic and liberty-loving men together, that will link those patriotic hearts as long as the love of freedom exists in the minds of men. Where? Throughout the world, not just America. It's not just about America, the United States. It's about the world at large. And again, over and over again, he links the Declaration to his global view of not simply emancipating Black people here, but expressing the need for freedom for people everywhere. What about Lincoln and labor? Slavery and labor were closely interrelated in his mind, and in fact, literally are closely interrelated. After all, these people are working as slaves, no recompense. Labor and labor movement had just begun to evolve within this country and in Europe within the decade or so before 15 years or so before the war began. Lincoln was very interested in the issue of labor, and he wanted to rationalize it, make it make sense. And by making it make sense, not only endow northern laborers, people, working people, after all, he had been endow them with the dignity they deserve, but also to rationalize part of his antagonism toward slavery. Here in 1856, says there is no greater injustice than to wring your profits from the sweat of another man's brow. This has a very biblical ring to it, because those of you who may know of the Hebrew Bible know that in Genesis, God admonished Adam and Eve as he kicked them out of the Garden of Eden by telling them they would have to earn their bread by the sweat of their brows. He was very attuned to what people could themselves latch onto. And in that era, in that environment, people knew the Bible, and they would recognize the intonation involved with the statement. Lincoln on Labor said quite a few surprising things. In his very first speech to the legislature, after being elected to the Illinois State Legislature in 1837, very first speech on the floor, he took time to criticize banks and railroads that were railroading honest people out of their properties and exploiting ordinary working people and farmers. And he said these capitalists generally work harmoniously to please the people. Just so there's no misunderstanding, he knew what he meant by the word capitalists. It's not a code word at that time. Capitalists in 1837 were people who ran corporations, people who ran banks, people who were unscrupulous in their attempts to advance themselves, even at the cost of ruining ordinary people who stood in their way, and particularly poor people who are poor farmers and the kind of poor white trash that he made. He then went on to say some other astounding things, astounding to many people today, not astounding at that time, but he did talk about labor, and in particular saying that labor is the superior of capital and deserves much the higher consideration. Now, he had read Marx. And read Marx in the sense that we don't know that he read anything from Das Kapital or the Communist Manifesto, but he knew Marx. Marx, throughout the 1850s, was writing as a writer for the British newspaper, and his articles were farmed out to American papers, particularly the New York Tribune, which is run by Horace Greeley, the largest circulation in North America. He read that paper religiously, Lincoln did. So he would have read Marx's byline, and he would have read the kinds of things that Marx was writing about. He was no Marxist, please don't misunderstand him. He's not really a socialist. But he was well aware of the labor movement. He was well aware of sort of the concepts that Marxism was broadcasting. Later, during the war, Lincoln had a number of friends who were not just socialists, but communists. He promoted Wiedemeyer, a well-known socialist, to brigadier generalship. That was by his authority, by his signature. And Willett, who was a communist and was part of forming the International Communist League, was also promoted to brigadier general by Lincoln. He knew these people. He was aware of what they stood for. He had some sympathy for them, though he remained a capitalist in the sense of espousing the need for trade, for profit, but not at the ultimate expense of the ordinary people. And I think that's an important aspect of Lincoln that needs to be emphasized, because it casts an important light on his own attitude toward not just slaves, but to working people of this country in general. In 1864, he was visited by the representatives of the New York chapter of the Working Men's Association, because they made him an honorary member. And he said the following: the strongest bond of human sympathy outside of the family relation should be one uniting all working people of all nations and tongues and kingdoms. Well, can anyone say workers of the world unite? It's essentially what he is saying here. So again, I think that's very illustrative of sort of his take, you might say on this issue. 1864 was the year, which Lincoln knew very well, was the first year organized by Marx in London, I believe. Yeah, I'm sure it was in London. Marx organized the first Internationale in 1864, and it was the year that the Working Men's Association also then later in that year was incorporated into the International Working Men's Association. So Lincoln had some friends, not that many. In the left upper hand corner is a portrait or picture rather of William Herndon, his law partner of 20 years. He'd also been his law student. Lincoln called him Billy. And Billy said of Mr. Lincoln only revealed his soul to but few beings, if any, and then he kept the corner of that soul from his bosom friends. He was not easy to know, much less for us. It was not easy for him to know, for people to know him at the time. Billy Herndon also said very famously, Lincoln's ambition was a little engine that would not quit. Then Frederick Douglass said of him, change in the attitude of government was vast and startling. He was swift, zealous, radical, my emphasis, and determined. And indeed, Lincoln was radical and ruthless in his pursuit of the goals that he felt were important. What about his so-called friends? Thaddeus Stevens, many of you may have seen the movie Lincoln. You may remember Thaddeus Stevens sort of heroically portrayed that pretty well, I think. He said in 1862, barely a year after Lincoln was inaugurated, as for future hopes, they are poor, as Lincoln is nobody. Charles Dana was handpicked by Lincoln. Charles Dana was what we call a wunderkind. He was a polymath, smart guy. He knew French. He read and spoke French and German fluently. Charles Dana was the man chosen by Lincoln to be Assistant Secretary of War, and was the man that Lincoln sent out to observe Ulysses S. Grant. He wanted to know if Grant was a drunk. He wanted to have Grant observed. And Dana's the man that he sent out to do so. And thankfully, Dana came back with the right report. But he said in 1862, that in the politics of Washington, the most striking thing is the absence of personal loyalty to the president. It does not exist. He has no admirers. So Lincoln, in many respects, functioned autonomously in pursuit of his goals. Did he interact with others? Of course he did, every day. Sometimes 100 or more in a given day. But he was strikingly alone with his own thoughts, his own beliefs, his own opinions, his own perspective. And these are the things that he applied. What did his opponents say? What is striking if you read written material and some of the transcribed material from his opponents north and south is how stridently racial they are. Everything said about Lincoln in some way or fashion criticized them on racial grounds. Very striking observation to make about people who criticize them. Did he have unique criticisms about specific policies? Of course he did. But the global attack on Lincoln was racially based. And here you see some of them by Douglass in Chicago, the Illinois Register. And the last one, on election day of 1858, handbills by the thousand were printed by the Democrat Party, Douglass's party, and distributed throughout the state and posted on walls, particularly Chicago. And what did it say? What did they feel was the best message to give on that day? A vote for the Republican candidate, they wouldn't even name him, is a vote to crowd white laborers out of and break the Negroes into the state. So, and why did they do that? Because they felt it worked. And by the way, it worked. It's one. So the opposition to Lincoln, as opposed to his global view of human dignity, was very narrowly confined to this sort of one-legged force attack based on this sort of racist animus. So I feel that Lincoln, as he began, as he approached the threshold of his presidency, was a complex man. He was acutely aware of his humble beginnings. He viewed the world at large through the moral principle of equality, using the Declaration as a compass in setting his attitudes toward slavery, race, and the sanctity of free labor. His political beliefs were grounded in the philosophy of active governance and the promotion of the general good. That sounds wonderful. This is my statement on it. But folks, this man had a hard edge, a very hard edge. It's illustrated by this, the last words of his speech at the Cooper Union in New York. Remember, he came to New York in 1860 in February. He was invited there because of the fact that he had made a number of speeches about not just about slavery, but about the course of the country. And the New York elites, yes, there were elites in New York even then. The New York elites wanted to see him. Greenleaf Whittier wanted to see him. Others wanted to see him and hear him and understand how he stood and how he spoke. And he said at the end of that speech, "Let us have faith that right makes might. And in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it." This man is not going to back down. This man has pledged that he's going to stand up for the principles that he believes in, and come what may, he will do his duty. So this is one of the most disappointing lines I've ever read by my kid. It's a very famous line. It's in his second inaugural, about halfway through. Remember, his second inaugural is his shortest inaugural speech ever, so it's not hard to read. This is, it makes it sound passive. The war came somehow, although he described in his speech that it came about as a result of slavery. It's very clear. The war came. Well, that's not true. The war was coming, and he knew the war was coming. He was well aware that the war was coming. The war was coming because of all the events that led up to his inaugural. December 1860, after his election, South Carolina, as you know, announced its secession. By the time he was inaugurated in March, between December and March, a total of 7 states had seceded. They had declared themselves a country, a government. They had already inaugurated a president. Jefferson Davis was inaugurated over a month before Lincoln was. Most tellingly, in December 1860, the Buchanan administration, the prior administration, had attempted to resupply Fort Sumter, send a ship down, supplies, announcing, by the way, hey, this has only food and other goods along those lines, no weapons. What happened? South Carolina militia, which had just been organized into its army, fired upon the ship and drove it away. December, 3 months earlier. So the first shots of the Civil War were not in April. They had already occurred. The first violence had already occurred. And Lincoln was well aware of that. He was well aware of that when he made his inaugural speech in March, when he pledged to defend federal property. Now, he went out of his way to say that. I'm not saying this in a censorious way, but this is part of his strategy. So I will defend all federal properties. Well, what federal properties can you possibly defend? They're all surrounded by Southern forces. Any attempt to, quote, defend them could only result in violence. He knew that. In the South, Southern forces and Southern states had not just taken over the post offices and the federal buildings, they took over depots. They took over warships, munitions. So the war didn't just come. The war was coming, was upon him. In fact, it was upon him within days of his inauguration, and he was well aware of that. April 12th, shots were fired in Fort Sumter. April 13th, Sumter surrenders. April 15th, he puts out a call for 75,000 militia. And on April 19th, he calls this an insurrection. We're going to talk about that in just a moment, because as this conflict erupted, people didn't know what to make of it. They didn't know how to handle this. It never happened before. What is this exactly? And how do we handle this insurrection? Horace Greeley very famously said, let them go. He said that a number of different ways. Let let the departed sister, let the sisters depart, let them go. 40,000 New York City businessmen, this still staggers my mind. In 1860, they got signatures from 40,000 businessmen who said that the perpetuity of the Union is more important than this or that subject of controversy. Figure it out, compromise, do something, but the Union shall not be dissolved. We don't care what that compromise is. And in fact, there were many compromises that were proposed, among them the so-called Treason compromise in the Senate. And what's very ironic about this, very delicious and historical way, is that among the points of that compromise was proposal to commit to a 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment in that compromise package would institutionalize slavery in this country forever. How ironic that the 13th Amendment that we finally passed eliminated slavery forever. So in December of 1860, the events that were going on, Lincoln wrote this to one of his political comrades. Let there be no compromise on the question of extending slavery. If there be, all our labor is lost and their law must be done again. Stand firm. The tug has to come, and better now than any time hereafter. Now, folks, what was the tug? The tug was war, and he knew it, and he prepared for it as he entered office. In his second inaugural, he also said that the magnitude and the duration was a surprise. And he said something that I think is very insightful, that the conflict, that rather each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. As the war began, something that people worried about, both North and South, was how this war, this conflict evolved. And what they were particularly worried about, and enunciated very clearly, that the war might evolve into a remorseless revolutionary struggle. Everybody, they did not want a remorseless revolutionary struggle. People in the United States, remember, it was still overwhelmingly white, overwhelmingly Anglo-Saxon, although there had been some recent infusions of others, Germans, Irish. They knew about civil war. There had been civil war in South America, there had been civil war in various parts of Europe, but most importantly, the most cogent, there had been civil war in England. They knew about the Civil War. They knew about the 30-year Civil War there. They knew about the devastation that it caused, the beheading of a king. They were well aware of that, and that's precisely what leaders wanted to avoid at the beginning. So when Lincoln talks about this, nobody foresaw that, and that may be true. He may not have foreseen it. But Lincoln was also part of the sword that was forged during the Civil War. And he, in fact, contributed this concept of a remorseless revolutionary struggle. He says here in his order, which is entitled Order of Retaliation, it is therefore ordered that for every soldier of the United States killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier shall be executed. There's an iron fist in that velvet glove. This is a long passage by John Yoo. Many of you may remember John Yoo. John Yoo was the Office of Legal Counsel for the White House during the Bush administration, and was very, very involved in formulating the concepts of presidential power in the context of the Afghan war, particularly, but also the Iraq war. How to use drones, who can use drones, who can authorize this and that. He was at the forefront of this, and he used the sort of guidelines that were developed during the Civil War as part of his rationale. In fact, if you read Hamdan versus Rumsfeld, the 2004 Supreme Court case, John Yoo presented that case to the Supreme Court, which was lost, by the way, but using extracts from the language that was used by Lincoln and his cabinet during the Civil War in order to justify the actions that Bush undertook. And by the way, the same authorities that President Obama then subsequently used as well, all extracted from this time. And he says that He invoked his authority as commander-in-chief and chief executive to conduct war initially without congressional permission, when many were unsure whether secession meant war. And that's a critical aspect of this because Lincoln was a lawyer. He was a good lawyer, in my opinion. And he was a very exacting lawyer. He was very exacting with words. He wanted to say exactly what he intended to say, what he wanted to say. And he was initially torn about how to react to what was going on. And there were three theses that were promoted, three possible viewpoints. One, these people who are seceding, these people, they're not the states. They're not the state. Mississippi didn't secede. These are gangsters. They're criminals. There are bands of criminals, well organized, better than the mafia, well organized, large numbers of them, but they are criminals causing criminal acts. Thesis one. Thesis two. These are enemies. It's another country. They created a country, and they are now enemies of the United States. And they have to be treated according to the laws of war. And the laws of war allow a lot, especially in the 19th century. They don't have any civil protections. In the first thesis, remember, these are citizens who are criminals. They have all the protections. They get hauled into court, and you're tried as a criminal. But in this thesis, these are enemies of our country. And we'll deal with them as the laws of war allow. Number three, these are rebels. They're committing treason. The Constitution defines treason, Article 3, Paragraph 3. And that's what they're doing. So these are rebels and can be treated as rebels. To complicate matters even further, the laws of nations, the conduct of nations in the 19th century made a distinction between civil war and rebellion. Civil war was defined loosely as the concept that a part of a country split off, defied the authorities of that country, and assembled a military force sufficient to make the parent country develop and confront it with a large, organized military force. Rebellion was a small group of people. The parent country did not have to mobilize its resources and could deal with them in a more casual manner. Why is it important? Because if it's a civil war, the custom at the time was that England, for example, or France, or Spain could remain neutral, but could have relations with both. So if I'm England, and this is a civil war, yes, I can send arms and munitions to Charleston, South Carolina. Why not? That's what countries did. So Lincoln was sort of caught in this web of possibilities. Of the three possibilities, how many think that he chose number one? How many of you think that these are gangsters? They're loose in the country. We have to apprehend them. Anybody think he chose that one? No. Number two, who thinks that this is a war? These are enemies of the United States, and we have to treat them according to the law of war. A couple, three here. How many think he chose the third? That these are rebels. Some uncertainty. So Lincoln chose all three. And at different times. And the courts, the federal courts recognized what was called the duality of this conflict. The duality in the one sense that these are, the courts decided that this was, in fact, criminal enterprise. And that's what Lincoln called it. If you read very carefully in his call for troops, for example, he called these combinations too powerful to suppress through ordinary means. And he alluded to them, as you see here. This is what he said: these are acts of violence within the United States, within any state or states. He never acceded or agreed that the states seceded. The states did not secede. Mississippi and Alabama and Carolina did not secede. It's the people within the states that are fomenting this problem. This is incredibly important because with Reconstruction, many radical Republicans wanted to absolutely wipe out all the lines. No more Alabama. It would be called Harpsichordia. A new state would be developing new lines. And he would say no. And had he been alive, he would have insisted that no, these states never left. People within the states are rebellious. And part of the problem with rebellion is rebels may be committing treason, right? Rebellion and treason are closely interlinked. I'm going off on a riff here, and I should get back to this, but that's a big issue. That's a big issue in terms of treason. And you may recall that after the war, not one important Southern leader was tried and convicted for treason. Not one. Jefferson Davis was done. I mean, Robert E. Lee approached the gates of Washington. He was not even tried for treason. So that's a whole nother story that I won't get into. But I think what I wanted to impress upon is the complexity of interpreting what was really going on if one wanted to stay within legal boundaries. And he went on to say this other aspect: was it possible to lose the nation and yet preserve the Constitution? And he felt that bending the Constitution was necessary in order to save the nation because the nation could not be saved through the mechanism of the Constitution. This is a theory developed by two lawyers. Bill Wright came from Harvard, and Franz Lieber, who's a professor of law at Columbia, collaborated in the War Department and enunciated the theory of constitutional inadequacy. The Constitution was inadequate to save the nation under these circumstances, so the president in turn had broad powers to do whatever he wanted to do. What were his powers? What were some of his powers? By the way, is Lindsay here? Yesterday I went about an hour and 15 minutes. Is that okay if I do that today? I don't know whether that's a problem for folks, or I could tie it up faster, but I still have some material to go through. So I probably will be about another 2 minutes. So Merriman, so that this issue of how to deal with people in these circumstances and the powers attendant to the president came up very quickly. After Lincoln called for militia in April, states began sending militia regiments down to Washington. Massachusetts sent a regiment that had to go through Baltimore. In Baltimore, there was a riot of people against the war and against actually Southern sympathizers, but thousands of them interdicted the column of soldiers. Fighting broke out, a few soldiers were killed, and several Baltimoreans were killed. As a result of this, I remember Maryland was a slave state. There were 2,100 slaves in Maryland at that time. As a result of this, legislature met, and legislature of Maryland decreed that we don't want any more Union soldiers going through here. And in order to enforce that, they authorized the militia to destroy roads and bridges that might be used by Union troops coming through Maryland heading for Washington, D.C. Well, this fellow Merriman was an officer in the militia. They were destroying a bridge, and Union troops came upon him and arrested him. Put him in jail. He's not allowed to see a lawyer. They certainly didn't Mirandize him by any means. And he was left there. He didn't even know what he did wrong. He was following his orders from his general, who had gotten them from the duly authorized legislature and the governor who's duly authorized to command him to destroy that bridge. What did I do wrong? Well, the message got through to an attorney who went to Roger Taney. Roger Taney was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the same Roger Taney who had rendered judgment in the Dred Scott case of 1857. And this whole issue about habeas corpus then came about. Now, Lincoln declared unilaterally that these corridors in Maryland that were needed for troops to come down were under martial law. Habeas corpus did not apply. Well, in Article 1 of the Constitution says the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in case of rebellion or invasion of public safety may require it. Well, that's not pretty clear cut, except that this is written in Article 1, which has to do with the legislature and the duties and functions of Congress, not in the subsequent section that had to deal with the duties and functions of the executive. So who is entitled to suspend habeas corpus? President, one man, or Congress assembled? By the way, Congress was not even in session. So this was not so clear. And furthermore, Tawney said the administration by force of arms thrust aside the judicial authorities and officers to whom the Constitution has confided the power and duty of interpreting and administering the laws. Sounds pretty cogent, right? Lincoln had already dealt with this issue back in 1860. He'd already, I think, perhaps anticipated issues that would come up with regard to legality of unilateral action by the executive. And he had said back then, if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. So yes, the Supreme Court is supreme in terms of judicial review, but not judicial authority, is what he's saying. And this is, by the way, this is the debate that goes on to this day. Review and authority being two different things. The Supreme Court does not have an army. Stalin once said about the Pope made a statement about how the war should be conducted. He said how many battalions does the Pope have? It was a statement he said on the Supreme Court. So it's supreme, but with an asterisk next to it. According to Lincoln, in 1860. I added this last part here, Orlando, for you all know that phrase. It's part of our national anthem, written by Francis Scott Key as he was watching Fort McHenry and the British attack upon it, and the rockets red glare and all that. I put it here because his grandson was an editor of a Baltimore newspaper who was virulently anti-Lincoln, and a few months after Merryman wrote a vicious article attacking Lincoln and denouncing Union forces and the attempt to attack the South. Union patrol came up to his house in the dead of night, picked him up, threw him over a horse, and imprisoned him. Where did they imprison him? Fort McHenry, which I think is, again, another delicious little twist of history in terms of the irony of it. And he languished there for months and months, again, suffering under this issue. So Lincoln knew that he needed legal backup, and in conjunction with his congressional allies in 1863, they took care of this. They took care of this so that he would have the legality to declare martial law and lapse of habeas corpus. By the way, just so you know, habeas corpus was imposed, the cessation or withdrawal of habeas corpus was imposed numerous times over numerous parts of the country. And here, the legislation says, whenever in his judgment, the president, whenever in his judgment, the public safety may require it, is authorized to suspend the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. In any case, throughout the United States, or any part thereof, in his judgment, on the judgment of one man, this fundamental privilege can be revoked. I think that's as close as we came to an actual tyrannical state, because Lincoln had now in his hands. Remember that America, all parts of the country, including the North, was divided into military departments, including the North. And we're going to see that very shortly in the Lattingham case. And these military departments were run by generals. Who ran the generals? The president. So if the president said to a general, there's somebody in your department who's really making a fuss, that person should be imprisoned, what do you think happened? So it's incredible, but true, this process did occur, and was best illustrated by this fellow Clement Lattingham. in America, in the North, there was a large group of an umbrella sort of designation of people who were opposed to the Union and opposed to war. They were called Copperheads. Now, within this large umbrella, there were different, factions arguing for different things. But the Copperheads were certainly a potent political force in the North. And as the war dragged on, and as the North did more and more poorly, particularly during 1862, in the conduct of the war itself, they grew more powerful and had a stronger voice of criticism. Well, this fellow Blattingham said a number of things. He's a Copperhead. He's against the war. He's against Lincoln. He's against the efforts to subdue the South. And he called among many things, a wicked, cruel, and unnecessary war. But this is a specific speech where he said this that triggered the subsequent response because Ambrose Burnside, who's the general in charge of the Department of Ohio, determined that this was a violation of General Orders number 38 and declaring disloyal sentiments and opinions with the object and purpose of weakening the power of the government. Had Blattingham arrested, just gotten out of Congress. He's an opponent, a political opponent. It's not Russia, it's not Putin. Political opponent is arrested for being critical of the administration. Not just thrown in jail, but thrown in jail without an attorney and put before a military tribunal. Convicted. What did they do with him? They brought him down south. They threw him into Southern lines. So he was picked up by Southern forces, arrested briefly, and then set free, and he made it to Canada. What did he do in Canada, from Ottawa? He announced his candidacy for governor of Ohio in absentia. He was nominated unanimously by the Democratic Party of Ohio. He ran, and this really worried Lincoln considerably because governors, both North and South, had great power in terms of supplying troops, organizing regiments and brigades, of course, munitions, and supplies. And he was really worried that Ohio might drop off the map if someone like Blattingham might win. And he even confided in people, watch out for Blattingham and his friends. They make trouble, we may have to arrest him again. He was wiped out. Blattingham lost by landslide, so it never became an issue. But principle was established. As I said, Lincoln was a lawyer. He wanted secure legal support for all of his measures. This came to a head. Actually, first, let me read what Lincoln said during his first report to Congress. It was not called the State of the Union address at that time. It was not even an address. It was a written message to Congress, and its very first one. He said, what we read here, the country generally has outgrown our present judicial system. Let the Supreme Court be of convenient number. This was a significant concern for Lincoln. Remember, I mentioned earlier that he constructed this very complicated theory about how to deal with Southern forces and what to call this conflict and deal with it. One of the issues that came up in 1861 and was going to be resolved by the Supreme Court in 1862 was the Piracy Acts. They're not called Piracy Acts, I'm sorry. Basically, because Lincoln refused to recognize the South as a country, although he was obscure about what he really called it, it was unclear what his blockade of the South really amounted to, because a formal blockade can only occur during war. So he came up with a, sort of an imaginative description of what this blockade was, and he didn't want to call it blockade, but there was a blockade. So an American ship, an American flag ship, was entering Savannah Harbor, was intercepted by the blockading ships of the Union, and there was these were called the prize trials, because these were prizes when these ships were intercepted. And the captain was arrested. Well, captain said, "Well, I'm an American. My ship is an American ship. I'm entering an American port. You said so yourself." Well, this argument was an important one. and it was going to be resolved by Supreme Court. Lincoln was terrified about what that result might be. And so, again, through cooperation with his legislative colleagues, the 10th Circuit Act of 1863 was formed, which added a Supreme Court justice to the 9 already in existence. And so when people asked, did Lincoln pack the court? Yes, he did. He was the only one to pack the court. Nobody else successfully packed it, but he did. And he won that case by vote. Interestingly, in that same act, I didn't include it here, there's a little proviso that said that a quorum would be 6. That was put in deliberately because he foresaw the possibility that he might need to have 4 justices rule in favor. Only 4 might agree and rule in favor. So in some way or fashion, the justices just didn't make it to that hearing. And it turned out that it was a 5-4 decision, 9. We can't talk about Lincoln without talking about the proclamation. Obviously, the Emancipation Proclamation was the crowning jewel of his administration. And Eric Foner, the great historian Eric Foner, who I do admire, said he may have been deeply anti-slavery, but he was no abolitionist before he became one that pushed. And of course, Greeley and the editorial published what was called the Prayer of 20 Millions, urging the president to abolish slavery in 1862. And Lincoln furnished his very famous reply, which you read here: "If I could save the Union by freeing some, none, or all the slaves, I would do so." This is the original clipping from the newspaper that you see on the side here. Lincoln said this and was roundly criticized this on August 22nd, 1862. 1 month to the day before that, July 22nd, 1862, he had already shown his cabinet declaration of the proclamation. The Emancipation Proclamation was written. It was sitting in his desk. Why? He was waiting for a victory in order to be able to issue it at the advice of Seward. He was waiting for something good to happen so that he could publish this on a high note. So the criticism that he had to be pushed is grossly unfair. And here's an example of why. These are measures that were taken by Lincoln and his administration from early on in the war to suppress slavery. He also did something else, which I didn't include here. So you can see he had to sign every one of these. He had, as president, he signed every one of these bills. He was not pushed, he pushed. So the idea that he was not avid in his pursuit of the abolishment and destruction of slavery, as it might be unfounded. In shortly after the war began, the end of 1860, a ship was intercepted in southern waters, captained by a fellow named Gordon. It was illegally conveying Africans from Africa as part of an illegal slave trade. Slave trade was abolished in 1818. So illegal slavery had just been going on regularly, however. So he's bringing in a shipment of prospective slaves. The ship was caught, he was arrested, he was tried, and he was hanged. The first and only time that a captain of a ship involved in illegal slave trade was hanged. Lincoln saw to it that he was hanged. And that was a clear message. No other slave ships were intercepted in that manner. It's possible a few got through, but if they did, they were lucky because this is one of his priorities. So this was clearly a momentous event as documented by these various people. Karl Marx wrote Lincoln a letter and congratulated him on the Emancipation Proclamation, and later said that Lincoln's place in the history of the United States and of mankind will nevertheless be next to that of Washington. I wanted to just touch on something that Seth Ackerman said, because we are running out of time, and where he said that this is a social, activist, commentator, current, writes in all the appropriate, liberal areas as a writer and a speaker. He's a very, very excellent speaker, by the way. He described this as a radical, indeed violent, social revolution that expropriated without compensation almost 1/4 of the productive wealth of the country. I just want to make a comment about that, because before the war began, scholars today estimate that the value of slaves in the United States was greater than the sum value of all the railroads, all the banks, and all the shipping industry. Greater. The United States is the only country wherein slavery existed, where the slaves were emancipated or freed, whatever term you wish to use, or freed themselves, however you may view them, without compensation. Brazil, Cuba, go down the line. Everywhere where there had been, Haiti, Santo Domingo, everywhere there had been slaves, they were free. Of course, Brazil being the last, well after the US. The owners were compensated. It sounds awful, by the way. I mean, it sounds like a bad concept to me, but nonetheless, they were not the US. Lincoln was not going to compensate. And in his, before he died, when he talked about Reconstruction, he never talked, after 1863, he never talked about compensation again. So I want to be very clear about that. So I'm going to skip through this very quickly. One of the concerns about the proclamation is what effect it might have on soldiers. Before the war, it was very clear, and scholars will, I think, universally agree that the vast majority of men who joined the Union armies fought to, quote, save the Union. And because of incredible bias and racism that occurred throughout our country at the time, the argument was by many that Lincoln should not touch slavery because if he did, the soldiers would stop fighting. McClellan warned about that. He said that if we declare the Declaration of freedom for slaves, the army will dissolve, his words. He did not dissolve. Stayed very intact, as you all know, and went on to win the war. And I think this first part, just very quickly, written by an enlisted soldier from the very famous 3rd Wisconsin Regiment, said, the rebellion is abolitionizing the whole army. You have no idea of the changes that have taken place in the minds of the soldiers in the last 2 months. Men of all parties seem unanimous in belief that to permanently establish a union is to first wipe out the institution of slavery. So the common soldiers themselves understood. We want to save the Union, and even if we're not terribly fond of Black people, to save the Union, we must abolish this excrement upon the land. And of course, if proclamation was crowned, this was the halo of his administration, where slavery was 13th Amendment. Slavery was once and for all completely destroyed. The second quote by John Wilkes Booth, I'm going to end on this because my time is way over and I do apologize. But I cheated a little bit. John Wilkes Booth did not say this after the 13th Amendment or necessarily directly because of the 13th Amendment. He said this in April, right after Robert Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The next night, Lincoln went out on his balcony at the Executive Mansion and gave a speech. And in his speech, he said for the very first time publicly that it's time to think about giving the vote to Blacks. All the soldiers, and in Lincoln's word, in the sentiment that would not fly today, said to all the soldiers, those who served, 210,000 of them, and to the intelligent, probably 50 guys friend. In any case, so Wilkes Booth heard this, and that's when he made this statement. But this was not in isolation. The 13th Amendment had passed. This was percolating. It was in the air. That what are we going to do with Blacks now that there's no slavery? They're all free. The country's won the war, basically. We're going to be reunited. We have to give them the vote. And it wasn't the vote that was the problem, right? It was not the vote. It was electing people. Not just to Congress, but to every small municipal office throughout the South. And this was anathema to Southerners and something that they could not tolerate. And that is really what led to its murder a few nights later. Regarding 13th Amendment, Thaddeus Stevens said the greatest measure of the 19th century was passed by corruption, aided and abetted by the purest man in America. Thaddeus Stevens came quite a ways from 1862. So I'm going to stop there because of time. Last few things I was going to talk about is his legacy, but I think we understand his legacy. He was a great man who enunciated great ideals and thought of himself not just as a member of the American nation, but as a person who lived within the world and who wanted the best attributes of America to be reflected to the world. And it's because of him, very directly, in a very direct line, that the human rights was enunciated in 1948. The Declaration of Human Rights enunciated in 1948 in San Francisco. So if you want to speak form, you see a direct line between him and those individuals who embraced those views and created that document. That I'll stop. Yeah.
America got rid of the colonialism with the War of Independence. But throughout Lincoln time, colonialism was rampant throughout the world.
Colonialism was certainly active in the mid, of course, in the 19th century.
Did he express any thoughts on colonialism?
Yes, he did. He had a few comments about colonialism. But it's hard to interpret. He was against what France and England were doing in Africa. And he said that. He said you cannot carve up Africa. But there was also a parochial interest there because as part of the American colonial settlement organization, which was taking free blacks from the US, bringing them to Liberia, a country that was founded by, it was actually the government was founded and the Constitution written by Liberian Americans, you might say. So he was heavily invested in Liberia. And what had happened, Liberia was first founded as a very large country, and adjacent countries, either under British or French domination, began to infringe on Liberia, and did so successfully, by the way. So it became a very small country. So whether he was saying that he was against what France and England were doing was in the global sense, or whether he was saying it in the context of their encroachment upon Liberia, at least to me, is not clear. And he didn't say it very often. It was not very often that he talked about this. But he did talk, however, about the rights of peoples to express their own ethnic and religious values without interference from others. And you know where he spoke about this? In the context of Mexico. Because as you remember, Mexico was basically invaded or taken over by France in 1863. And of course, Lincoln could not intervene there, although he did send 50,000 troops to the border just as he was dying, just before he died, as a warning to France. And he helped Mexico get munitions. But he issued this sort of global statement that, very much like Wilson later on in 1920s after World War I, that peoples had a right to self-determination. And he talked about that. So that easily would be applicable to Africa as well. But he didn't say that in direct reference to Africa. He didn't do all things for all people. That's true. He did not. Yes.
How long have you studied to be able to get all of that?
Yeah. So somebody asked me last night, how did I get into this? So I was born in another country. I was born in Greece. I came to this country when I was young, a young boy, and I didn't know English. Of course, I had to learn English, and I can recall, and maybe it's my imagination. I don't think so. I think I can recall that the very first book that I was able to really read was a picture book of Lincoln. It was, those books that have the thick cardboard pages that have little, yeah, it's one of those. And looking at this person and reading, and I was very struck by the fact that he was very poor when he was young. And it showed pictures of that, and so I became interested in Lincoln. So I have been interested in Lincoln since about the age of 6. But only through that happy stage. If I picked up a book of someone else, it would be someone else, I suppose.
Is there any recordings of his voice?
No.
That's a shame. I would have liked to hear what he
the last eyewitness to Lincoln who saw him in life died, believe it or not, in 1961. He was a little boy and he was present at Ford's Theater and was looking at Lincoln. He actually saw the assassination. He saw Lincoln shot and died.
My grandmother said she was born hearing her parents talk about the assassination all the way to
Imagine that.
and
Yeah, imagine that.
But how do you ever impart this whole? It's such a large,
Yeah, you can't.
so much information.
I mean, there's so many seminars of days, of 2 or 3 days duration, with 8 lectures a day, are not sufficient to talk about. And by the way, I didn't talk about the campaigns at all. Something I'm very interested in. I love the campaigns, the actual military campaigns, military strategy, and what Lincoln did with regard to all that. I mean, Gettysburg every year has a series of lectures on various aspects of the Civil War. So 3 or 4 a day, and it goes on for 5 days. So, and you can't cover all that information. And by the way, the lecture I gave today, I think you can tell that I'm a devotee of Lincoln. I think Lincoln was an incredibly great man, great person. However, I could have, if I wished, I could have given a lecture that would have portrayed him in a very different light. I did a little bit of that, didn't I? I mean, Arthur Schlesinger called him a despot. Well, what was he? How can you define him otherwise? He abrogated all these authorities himself. And I talked about the Hamdan case. Well, remember that our Supreme Court here in 2004 ruled against the government.